I suppose I should begin by telling you how I got interested in the Coolik family that lived in Reynolds for 28 years and left Reynolds 8 years before I was born. First, I remember my daddy and granddaddy talking about the Cooliks. I knew they were Jewish, and that was unusual for a town such as Reynolds. And I suppose that is why I listened a little when they spoke about them. Daddy talked about Sammy Coolik a lot. They were in the same class for their entire school existence, which was 11 years at that time. They both left for Emory together in 1936. I also knew Sammy was a great golfer. A few years ago, Jamie Whitley and I started a private Facebook group called Old Reynolds. We both began doing research from old Butler Heralds about people and families who came from Reynolds. We also posted photos. It caught on during COVID, and the group began to grow, and more people began posting their photos and their family stories. Sometimes we would post information that possibly would not turn out to be 100% correct, but others would correct it. It became a group project, and today it is a treasure, not only for the now over 1,300 members of this page, who are people with Reynolds roots, but hopefully it will be a treasure for the next generation that comes. Because I had heard of them all my life and saw all the Coolik newspaper ads in the local paper, I began to investigate the Coolik family. I was amazed at what I found. Several things jumped out at me. First, this was a Jewish family that was obviously welcomed with open arms by the people of Reynolds. They were successful in business. They were very involved in the community. It was obvious they were loved by everyone. There are two things that hit me. The Cooliks were a special family, and Reynolds was a special town made up of special people. Both of those things had to be true. So the purpose of this presentation is to walk you through some of what I've learned about the Cooliks and the town they called home. The information I will present is factual to the best of my knowledge, but I've learned in doing research like this, sometimes the information I have can be subject to correction. Sometimes the newspapers are even incorrect, but this is my best shot. I am sure the Coolik family has much more information and can correct the errors I make, but this is a story worth telling, even if it is only 95% correct. This first photo is some of the Coolik family sitting in chairs on the front lawn of their beautiful home in Reynolds. I estimate this picture was taken around 1938. Sam and Nora had graduated high school by then and were off to college. You can see David and Sophie sitting in the chairs. This photo is what Reynolds looked like when the Cooliks were in business. I am not sure when this photo was taken, but I would guess in the early 1940s based on the automobiles. Reynolds was a busy town in those days. Saturdays were really busy. Everybody came to town on Saturday. Here's a closer look at Coolik's store, which was 2 stories. It was obviously a very busy place. David opened this store in 1918, and he sold the business in 1946. When David and Sophie Coolik moved in 1946, they had been in Reynolds 28 years and raised and educated all their children here. David was a shrewd businessman for sure. Here's David and Sophie Coolik. What a great-looking couple. Not only were they shrewd business people, but they were involved in everything Reynolds and became a huge part of the community. Notice the name of the store in March 1918, which was apparently their grand opening. It was called the Globe Outfitters. We'll talk about that later. Also notice Dave Coolik and his brother-in-law, Oscar Drazen, were both managers of the store when he first opened. David often traveled to New York City to purchase fabric and other products to sell at his store and other Globe Outfitters in Middle Georgia. In those days, that trip by train would take about 30 to 36 hours. Notice the store was rebranded to become Coolik store after a few years. The Cooliks were aggressive advertisers in the local papers and with other flyers. They went after business and apparently were marketing gurus. Bill Watley comes from one of the most prominent families in Reynolds. He had 4 brothers who are all deceased now who did very well in life. The Watley family moved to this area soon after the Revolutionary War. Their roots run as deep as one can get in Reynolds. Bill has lots of personal memories of the Cooliks. He is a retired architect who lives in Atlanta and moved there from Reynolds after the war. He continues to maintain a house in Reynolds and visits often. He deeply regrets that he could not be here in person today to share in person and greet each one of the Cooliks in attendance. Amazing the mind he has at his age. I'll let him tell you how old he is.
I was born in 1925. I was born in May, on the 12th of May. And this coming May, ahead of us, I will be 100. I'm presently 99. The Coolik store. Well, let me say this. The fact is, it was the ground floor of what is commonly known in Reynolds as the Souter Building, and that it was the center of all the merchandise in the city of Reynolds, because everybody relied on the Coolik store for so many items in the family, the clothing and shoes and so forth. My earliest reflection or thought about the Coolik store was when I went to it to start in the first grade at the Reynolds High School to buy my first pair of shoes at the Coolik store. As a boy, we went barefooted all through summer. And we bought our only pair of shoes in the fall so that we could go to school. Mr. Coolik, he always appeared to respect himself and the community by dressing well. I know some of that was the fact that he was a vendor in clothing and so forth, and he did meet with shop owners from time to time. I remember him distinctly, always in a suit. When he came to the store, if he had something to do, he would remove his coat and do what he needed to do in his shirt sleeve, but not outside the store. He would put his coat back on. Lack of a better word, he was a vendor in that he did have a line of clothing and shoes that he sold to other merchants in other towns in Georgia. He did travel a lot. He traveled so much that he wound up with his own driver so that he didn't have to do all the driving. He was a local man from the community. That was Puster Parker. He was a member of the Parker family, a black family that lived in Reynolds. They were noted, the whole family was, for their bricklaying ability. Mr. Parker saw that his boys did follow in his profession. Edith, who was our youngest child, was a daughter, was entered the first grade at the local school, along with me and the other. So she attended that school with me the whole time that she was in Reynolds. We weren't on the same level because Edith was so much smarter than I was. We all looked up to Edith for her intelligence. The first home, I have a vague memory of it before it burned. The first home I remember was wood. I distinctly remember when the first home burned because, as I said, Edith was in my class and in the first grade, And I remember someone coming to the door at the classroom and calling Edith out into the corridor and tell her and explain to her that her home had burned. During the interim, they did live in a rented home there in Reynolds, and it no longer exists now because of age. The years took it, but it was a wood home, but it was in another location. I do not remember the burned house. I do remember well where it stood, and I remember that the new house was built in the same location, but built out of brick, and it was a very I won't say lavish, but it was a well-designed home, befitting his position in the community. Mr. Brown Marshall was an attorney. Now, I'm not saying that he was Mr. Coolik's attorney, because I did not know that. They were very good friends. The second home that he built was a brick home, and it was closer to his store. Later on in life, when the Coolik family retired and they moved to Macon, the home was purchased by the Marshall family, the daughter, Blanche Marshall. As I knew her then, she was Blanche Brunson by the time they bought it. They were close in that development of the golf course out there, well, for several reasons. One is that the Marshalls and the Cooliks were friends, and also Mr. Coolik, we called him Dave. He had his position in the community. He was Mr. Reynolds. All of us younger boys or males, we all loved Sammy because he was such a great golfer. Since his family was involved in the development of the Reynolds golf course, and I will say this, that every time that there was a golf tournament at that golf course, Sammy took the first place. He was always the top winner. I have no knowledge of him ever having professional instructions. I think it was a self-built part of his life to excel in golf, because he was a good golfer. My wife's father and Mr. Charlie Neisler were brothers. They developed that bank. It was Citizen State Bank, and the business ability of Mr. Coolik and Mr. Charlie Neisler were pretty close together. They were excellent businessmen, and the community relied on them for direction in that effect. Reynolds was a special town, being a small rural city in itself. It's amazing what occurred in that city. The people that were raised in that and grew up in that city, and their position, not only in the local city and so forth, but it extended even into state government and into business world. It's my understanding that Edith became very prominent in the business world herself. Edith and I did enjoy each other's comfort from time to time, because their second home, was close to the women's club there in Reynolds, where we younger people had dance. On occasions, we called it at that time, we had dates, and I would go by the Coolik home and walk Edith to the dance. So we weren't unrelated. I knew nothing about Mr. Coolik's religious association, because I was too young to understand at that time. It never entered into their life in Reynolds on downside at all. I do remember that my mother and Miss Coolik did enjoy their association because they both had fairly large families. And I know good and well that size of the families played a big part in their friendship. I got my education after the war because I wanted to be an architect, and it took me 5 years and 2 degrees at Tech to get there. They meant a lot to me, and I practiced my profession all over the state. In Alabama, I had licensing there in South Carolina, and so forth. I don't know how well I did in my profession, but I had a pretty good family to support, and it was right in the Great Depression, so it wasn't an easy life. I'll put it that way. I'm proud of the fact that my grandmother and grandfather set the pattern for what I understand the Whitley family as I know it, because my granddaddy did not have more than a third grade education. My grandmother could not write her own name, but every one of their children, they saw that every one of their children had a college education and in an established profession. I do know, as a young boy, to know things, that Mr. Coolik was one of the most respected businessmen in Reynolds, Georgia, or in a period he was respected for his ability. And also, the main thing that stands out to me was that his acceptance in the community, his position in the community, and his desire to be available in the community. I think if anything needed discussing in the community, everybody wanted to know how Dave Coolik felt about it. See, he was the ear to the ground, I guess. I don't know how else to describe it. Well, I failed to mention this about Mr. Coolik's relationship with the people in the city of Reynolds. He and my uncle Clay Whitley were big buddies. I saw Mr. Coolik over drinking a Coke at Clay Whitley's drugstore so many times, and they would just sit and talk. And I also know the same thing existed. Well, you mentioned Charlie Neisler, C.H. Neisler, and you left out Mr. Goddard, E.A. Goddard, and his relationship with the Cooliks. I thought that was a beautiful sight because the Goddards were also sold shoes and so forth in their store. So I thought that was something to be noted, because they all had the same love for their community and the people that they lived with and did business with. I'll try to explain this to people that never lived in a small town, and certainly not one that had the backbone, or whatever you want to call it, that I see that Reynolds had. I started thinking about the people of note that have come out of that little community, and it's staggering. Now, I will have to give credit for the superintendent of our schools, Mr. E.H. Joyner. He put a lot of himself into his students. Well, Bruce, I want to thank you personally as a friend for considering me as one that could add to the distinction and appreciation of the Coolik family's position in Reynolds, Georgia. I'm so disappointed, and I hope you will relate with your connection to the Coolik family that I can't think of anything I would have rather been doing at this time than to have them to understand as much as I can have them understand what a person Mr. Coolik was. He was exceptional in our community.
Interestingly, David Coolik quickly became the vice president of the Citizen State Bank. Charlie Neisler was the most prominent businessman in town and was known throughout the state. Charlie Neisler was no dummy. I am sure David Coolik was a larger depositor in his bank, but Charlie also trusted him completely. Charlie's younger brother was the cashier, which meant he basically ran the bank while Charlie and David Coolik oversaw it. This advertisement appeared in the Butler Herald in July 1925, 7 years after arriving here. I don't know when David Coolik became vice president of the bank, but he was in 1925. When I talk about the Cooliks being accepted in Reynolds, this is a good example. From what I have seen in immigration records, David Coolik migrated to America in 1901. His wife, Sophie, came 12 years later in 1913. David would have been either 15 or 16 years old, and it appears he lived the next 16 or so years in New York City, and as a young man became successful in retail business in New York. I suppose during that time he met two brothers who had a store in New York City and were expanding to other parts of the United States, which would eventually include Reynolds, Georgia. He became associated with them. David married Sophie Aronson on August 1st, 1917. I have to believe at that point they knew they were moving to Georgia. They had opened their business in Reynolds just months after their marriage in New York City. It's hard for me to get my head around how many of his relatives came with him to Reynolds. I know his sister Rebecca and her husband Oscar Drazen were with him, as was David Coolik's 12-year-old brother Louis. But I've also read about Morris Coolik, a cousin, who eventually was in business in Newnan, and Gussie, who I will talk about later. I do know the Coolik's mother lived in Savannah because I can see in the paper that David and his sister Rebecca visited her and other relatives there from time to time. It is not hard to understand why Polish Jews were migrating to America at the turn of the 20th century. Anti-Semitism was rampant. There was economic hardship and political chaos and instability. Jewish communities were established in places in America by then, so they had somewhere to go. The opportunities were enormous, and the Jewish people did not want to get sucked in a war in Poland. As I mentioned, we do know that David had been in America for close to 17 years when he came to Reynolds. Yiddish was most likely their first language. As I mentioned, it is obvious that the Cooliks were welcomed with open arms in Reynolds. I happen to know they could not have picked a better place to settle. I am quite certain that was a God thing. Why did the Cooliks come to Reynolds? I cannot know this for sure, but I will say what I think I know. I learned that Globe Outfitters was founded in New York City by Jewish brothers Solomon and Joseph Lesser. David Coolik was a successful retailer in New York City as a young man, and maybe he worked for the Lesser brothers there. But it appears he came here as part of the leadership of Globe Outfitters. From what I've read, he owned the store, but part of his job was to look for other places to open stores. In many instances, he put his family members in business in different towns in Georgia. There were only 2 Globe Outfitters stores in Middle Georgia in 1918 when the Cooliks moved to Reynolds. One was in Macon and the other was in Cordele. Eventually, there were at least 6 Globe Outfitter stores in Middle Georgia, and probably more. Macon, Cordele, Columbus, Reynolds, Americus, Fort Valley, and Butler. Additionally, Cousin Morris was also in business in Newnan. There is no question David Coolik was a smart businessman. But he was Jewish, living in a small conservative Middle Georgia town, full of Methodists and Baptists. There was not a Jewish person here before they came. There was certainly no synagogue in Reynolds. They took a big risk in coming to Reynolds. It turns out David Coolik's risk paid off. Let me speak a little about Reynolds. It was an unusual town. There's no way I can begin to name the people who came out of this town that made their mark on this world. I can tell you the Cooliks would certainly be on that list. Will Camp Seeley, a 1929 graduate of Reynolds High School, was featured in Life magazine in 1958 performing hypothermic cardiopulmonary bypass surgery. He did the first heart ablation. His brother Hugh was a 1942 graduate of Reynolds High School. He attended med school at Duke University and became a very well-known cardiologist in Macon, Georgia. A floor of the medical center in Macon was named after him. Julius Lunsford Jr., who grew up across the street from the Cooliks, became a famous trademark lawyer. Among many other accomplishments, he registered the Coca-Cola bottle and the Little League baseball trademark. Garland Byrd was elected Lieutenant Governor of Georgia in 1958 and was a front-runner for the race for governor in 1962, but had a heart attack and had to end his campaign. Steve Carpenter is a well-known gastroenterologist in Savannah and was Greg Allman's doctor when he passed away. My good friend Jimmy Childry Jr. has served on more national boards that can be mentioned here and has postgraduate degrees or certificates from Duke, Harvard, Cambridge, HEC Paris, and Oxford. His father, who also grew up here, has been one of the most successful businessmen in Georgia. Chris Borders, longtime manager of the prestigious Atlanta Athletic Club, who hosted many PGA events, including the PGA Championship, grew up here and learned to play golf on the Reynolds Golf Course. He's a member of the Georgia Golf Hall of Fame. Jack Kirksey was on PT 109 with John F. Kennedy and was one of the 2 souls who were killed during that incident. Kennedy became a war hero and was elected President of the United States largely due to his heroics after that boat was attacked. He stayed in touch with Jack Kirksey's widow and his family for the rest of his life. I will mention a couple of other notable citizens in a bit. Reynolds High School was a very small school. Less than 100 in the entire high school would be my guess. During World War II, 61 Reynolds High School graduates were in the armed services. 21 of them were officers. There have been at least 25 medical doctors come out of Reynolds, and who knows how many lawyers, nurses, ministers, educators, and business leaders. Earl Little was born in Reynolds. He was the father of Malcolm X. The highest the population ever got was 1,200. Reynolds was a special place. This is a photo of Reynolds High School that opened in 1917 after the previous school, Coleman Institute, burned the previous year. Sadly, the building was demolished in the 1980s. All of David and Sophie's children were educated in this school, from the first grade until they graduated. All of them graduated with honors, by the way. The superintendent, a principal, and teacher during their entire tenure at this school was Eugene Joyner, who was hired in 1909 and ran this school until his retirement in 1959. He stayed in Reynolds after retirement and died here in 1974. Mr. Joyner was quite a taskmaster. Ask most anyone who graduated from Reynolds High School under him, and they will tell you Mr. Joyner gets much credit for their academic success and future success in their worlds. There were some who did not like him, for sure, but he was an iconic educator nonetheless. This slide is for local folks as a point of reference for the Coolik children with just a few names. Jack Kirksey, Woodfin Hinton, and my dad, Ed Goddard, were in the class with Sam Coolik. Thomas Byrd, Garland's brother, Betty Neisler, Charlie Neisler's daughter, Henry Posey, and Mary Freeman Martin, and Louise Waters, who married Woodfin Hinton, were in the class with Nora. Dr. Edwards Watley, longtime doctor in Reynolds, Francis C., Louise Ogburn, and Harold Posey were classmates with Molly. Gloria Watley, Don Watley, Carolyn Kilby, Bill Watley, Mac Lucas, and Hugh Seeley were classmates with Edith. Let's go back and look at the Coolik timeline, recap, and then move forward. David and Sophie married in New York City in 1917. In 1918, they moved to Reynolds and lived on Winston Street, somewhere close to where Ben Hinton built his house. Also in 1918, their first child was born on December the 19th. He started college at Emory but transferred to Vanderbilt, where he got his degree. He spent 4 years in service during World War II. He died at 46. In 1920, according to the census, it appears the Drazens were living on Collins Street next to the Hollis residence. I assume they were living in what became the Joe Goodrow house. Also in 1920, David Coolik and Oscar Drazen bought Globe Outfitters in Butler, which soon became Drazen's store. And in 1920, Nora Coolik was born. After she graduated from Reynolds High School, she attended the University of Georgia and was a 1941 graduate. She married a man who became a very prominent businessman in Macon, Alvin Copeland, who was the president of Macon Iron and Paper Stock for many years. This couple were movers and shakers in the Macon community. Speaking of Oscar Drazen and Rebecca moving to Butler, the Drazens did exactly what the Cooliks had done in Reynolds and immersed themselves in the community of Butler. They were extremely successful for 25 years until he sold the business due to health reasons and moved to Macon. This is a picture of Drazen's store, and you can see the name can still be seen at the entrance of the old store building. Oscar also invested in people in Butler. Austin Gwynn Sr. is a good example. In 1936, Austin could not get money from a bank to expand his chicken business, probably due to the fact that our nation was just coming out of the Great Depression. Incredibly, Oscar Drazen lent Austin $1,480. That would be around $30,000 today. Very risky for Mr. Drazen, I am sure, especially in 1936. Austin Gwynn went on to have a very large and successful chicken business and became world famous at his Peach Valley Egg Farm and Hatchery in Taylor County. He had a hen who was the first ever to produce 300 eggs in a year. Austin Gwynn was a master at raising chickens and literally became known not only in the United States, but in other parts of the world. His success would never have happened if not for Oscar Drazen. Gussie Coolik married Joe Coleman in the Dave Coolik home, which was a beautiful wooden structure. Gussie's brother-in-law, Oscar Drazen, was the best man, and David Coolik, her older brother, gave her away. I couldn't help but notice in a newspaper article, among all the other guests, my 81-year-old great-grandfather, E.A. Goddard, attended the wedding. Later that year, Molly Coolik was born. She was a 1940 Reynolds High School graduate and a 1944 graduate of the University of Alabama. She married Cindy Ginsburg from Montgomery. She had lived in Atlanta for 30 years when she died in 1994. David and Sophie's last child was born in 1925. She was a 1942 graduate of Reynolds High School and a 1946 graduate of the University of Alabama. She married a Georgia boy, Herbert Besser, who started Besser Paper Company that turned into Best Pack. Best Pack was a large manufacturer of plastic bags and cartons with operations in Alabama and Texas. Well, Herbert died in 1975, and Reynolds' gal Edith became chairman of the board of Best Pack. Under Edith's leadership, they produced the first biodegradable garbage bags. Edith's picture was on every carton sold all over the United States. Edith's disappearing trash bag. She became famous. She always gave credit to her husband for inventing this, but she pushed his idea and product across the finish line. Soon there was another Polish-Jewish family in town, the Jacob Prager family. Jake Prager opened for business in 1925. Here's one of his ads. I don't know if the Pragers were relatives of the Cooliks or not, but I'm sure David Coolik had something to do with him coming to Reynolds to open a business. Interestingly, Jake's girls only attended Reynolds elementary schools a couple of years. The three girls and their mother moved back to New York City. Jake kept operating his business in Reynolds, but he traveled back and forth to New York. I read in a paper that one of his daughters received a scholarship from New York University because she made the highest score in all of New York City on, I assume, a standardized English test. These were smart people. Jacob closed his business in 1940 after being very successful here for 15 years. He died in 1952 in New York, but visited Reynolds from time to time after he moved. Did David Coolik have anything to do with Jake Prager coming to Reynolds? I don't know the answer to that for sure, but I suspect he did. Brown Marshall was a lifelong Reynolds man, prominent lawyer, and entrepreneur. He discovered golf while living briefly in Americus in the late 1920s and brought the game to Reynolds. He first put a coffee can in the ground at the city park and encouraged people to putt to it. He founded the golf course in 1929, and much has been written about it. This golf course is still in operation today and has been a big part of the story of Reynolds. Many of us first learned to play golf on that course. Recently, Reynolds Historic Golf Preservation Foundation, Inc., was formed. This 501(c) not-for-profit foundation was formed to raise money for needed equipment at the golf course. The goal is to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the club in 2029. So far, the foundation has been successful. David Coolik was part of the core group in Reynolds who built the first 4 holes of the course and learned to play at the same time. David was a charter member, an original stockholder, and one of the big reasons the golf club got off the ground and soon expanded to 9 holes. You're looking at the D. Coolik Trophy that Brown Marshall's daughter Blanche won at a tournament there. That trophy is still around some 90 years later. My understanding is the Coolik family is a golfing group. Make no mistake, your golfing talent and love for the game began right here in Reynolds, Georgia, at the Reynolds Golf Club. You can credit Dave Coolik and Brown Marshall for that. Speaking of golfers, Sammy Coolik, David's son, was the best golfer in town for a number of years. I know he won the club championship at least 3 years in a row, the last time while he was home for the summer from Vanderbilt. He beat H.C. Bond badly, 7-6. That means he was up 7 holes with only 6 to play on an 18-hole match. And H.C. Bond, who owned the phone company, was a great golfer, and had obviously beat everyone else to even get into the final match. I want to show you a few of David Coolik's close friends. This is my grandfather, George Goddard, and my grandmother, Lucy. The other photo is my grandfather and great-grandfather standing in their store building in the early 1920s. My family was in business in Reynolds for 131 years, with 110 years of that in one building that still stands. Interestingly, during the time the Cooliks were in business, George and David were somewhat competitors, but they were also friends. There were many examples of that in Reynolds in those days. Competitors and friends. Lucy was originally from Tobbleton. I have read several newspaper clippings of the 4 of them, the Cooliks and Goddards, traveling together to Tobbleton to visit relatives. Lucy's daddy lived there. David Coolik's younger brother and his family lived there. It would have taken them almost 2 hours to get there in those days. Another close friend of David Coolik was Brown Marshall that we've talked about. I mentioned them working together to build the golf course. Brown was another noted person from Reynolds. For starters, he was extremely smart. He entered Mercer University at age 13 and graduated at 17. He went to law school at the University of Georgia and then finished law school at Columbia University in New York City. He was an Olympic-caliber track star at both universities and was invited to participate in the Olympics, but declined. He set several track records at both universities. He upset the Columbia folks big time when he resigned from the track team to finish school and get back to Georgia. The fact that he learned to play golf and brought the game to Reynolds is not surprising. Brown had been a world-class athlete. On another note, when cousin Morris Coolik got married in January 1932, Brown traveled to Tampa, Florida, which had to be quite a trip, with Oscar Drazen and David Coolik for the wedding, again demonstrating their close friendships. When David and Sophie sold out in 1946, they sold their 7-year-old house they had built to Brown's daughter and her husband. I would bet he gave them a good deal. Another noteworthy citizen of Reynolds and Coolik friend was C.H. Neisler, known as Charlie, I believe, to his many friends. He was probably the most prominent businessman who ever lived in Reynolds. Remember, he was the chief stockholder and president of the Citizen State Bank, where he made David Coolik vice president. Well, he had all kinds of business ventures going on, from a cotton warehouse to a car dealership. He was the largest landowner in the county, farmer, cattleman, and orchardist. Charlie was also into politics at the local level as mayor and alderman, and at the state level as a state senator and state representative. He was also a well-known speaker and lecturer. We know he and David Coolik were close friends and like two peas in a pot. Getting back to the timeline, in 1932, disaster happened. The Coolik's beautiful home burned to the ground around 2 p.m. on April the 14th. Investigators determined the attic wire was faulty. They lost everything, which amounted to $10,000 in 1932. Present value of those dollars will be $215,000. They were only partially insured. As you heard Bill Watley earlier, he vividly remembers as a child when they came to the school to get his friend Edith when her house burned down. They would have been 7 years old, but Bill never forgot that. But the Cooliks were a resilient clan. They immediately began building a beautiful brick house on the same lot. You will see that house today. While building the new house, the Cooliks rented the Wright residence in East Reynolds. Bill Watley remembers visiting their temporary home on Mims Street after the fire. But they moved into the new house as soon as they could get it built. So in 1932, their house burned, but they soon began construction on the new house. In 1933, Lewis Coolik, the much younger brother of David, was living in Savannah, and he got a job as the state representative for Reed Shoe Company. Reynolds and Butler were part of his territory. A couple years later, in 1935, Lewis was running his own Coolik store in Tobbleton, and like his siblings, would go on to run a very successful business. In 1939, David Coolik built a new house in Reynolds and sold his 7-year-old house to another prominent businessman who had been associated with Charlie Neisler, Bob Swearingen. Bob's grandson lives in that house today. 3 years after building the new house, the Coolik's oldest daughter, Nora, married Alvin Copeland of Macon in 1942. Also in 1942, Aaron Drazen, the son of Oscar and Rebecca, enlisted in the United States Army on October the 24th. 15 months later, Staff Sergeant Drazen was killed in action in Germany. A young man sacrificed his life for his adopted country. A family was brokenhearted. Staff Sergeant Drazen was posthumously awarded the Air Medal by the President of the United States. Not surprisingly, in 1945, Lewis Coolik, who was running a very successful business in Tobbleton, bought the Drazen business in Butler from his brother-in-law and soon changed it to Coolik's. The paper says they sold out for health reasons. Oscar apparently had a heart attack, and you can't help but wonder if the tragic death of their son had something to do with his heart attack and the sale of their business. That same year, David Coolik sold Coolik's store in Reynolds to Paul Buster McDaniel. And as I have mentioned, the Cooliks sold their home to Will Frank and Blanche Brunson. Blanche was the daughter of David's close friend, Brown Marshall. I bet they got a good deal on that home. I am very familiar with Greenwood Cemetery in Montgomery. During my career in the business world, it was in my area of responsibility for several years. I did not realize the Cooliks were buried there then. David died in 1957 at 71. Sophie died 2 years later at 65. And their oldest son, Sam, the great golfer, died in 1965 at only 46. They were all together at Greenwood Cemetery. Over in Riverdale Cemetery in Columbus lies Louis Coolik, the younger brother of David, who ended up owning at least 2 Coolik stores, one in Tobbleton and one in Butler. Nora, David and Sophie's oldest daughter, lived a long life and died at 88 and is buried in Rose Hill Cemetery in Macon. Molly, the middle daughter, died at 76 and is buried at Arlington Cemetery in Sandy Springs. Edith, the youngest child of David and Sophie, who became famous in the biodegradable bag business, died at 68 and is buried at Greenwood in Montgomery, close to her parents. Oscar Drazen, 1890 to 1968, lived to be 77. His wife and sister of David Coolik, Rebecca, 1893 to 1977, lived to be the ripe old age of 84. Their beloved son, Aaron, 1922 to 1945, sacrificed his life for the United States. The three are buried side by side at Shara Israel Cemetery at Rose Hill in Macon. I can't end this without mentioning this bit of information. Carla Copland Cone, daughter of Nora and Alvin Copland of Macon, is pictured here with baseball and Brave legend Hank Aaron. She was his personal secretary for many years, which included handling the hate mail that came his way when he was chasing Babe Ruth's record. You also may recognize this lady from the Today Show in New York City. She's Carla's daughter and the great-granddaughter of David and Sophie Coolik. Her name is Jen Fallick. So here's the Coolik family pictured around 1956 in Montgomery. David and Sophie Coolik are shown on the back row with all 4 of their children. I mentioned earlier that Charlie Neisler, David's close friend, gave speeches from time to time. In one instance, he was speaking to the Agricultural College at the University of Georgia. I was privileged to read his entire speech. During that speech, he quoted a line from a poem, The Winds of Fate, by Ella Wheeler Wilcox. A ship sails east, and a ship sails west, by the very same wind that blows. 'Tis not the wind, but the set of the sails, that determines the way she goes. Mr. Neisler added this. In all lines of endeavor, it may be observed that one man succeeds while another, under what appears to be identical conditions, fails. This being the case, it is fair to assume that not the conditions, but whether they are properly or improperly applied to the undertaking, is responsible for the outcome. The conditions may be likened unto the wind in which this poet sings. Whether the undertaking moves forward toward success or backward toward failure depends upon the human agency behind it, to the manner in which its sail is set. The Coolik family came to Reynolds, Georgia, and set its sails for success. The human agency behind that endeavor that moved this family forward was David Coolik, and the Coolik family is the beneficiary. So we're about to take you on a little tour of all things Coolik and Reynolds. Hope you get lots of pictures.